Let me tell you what I know about Alexander the Great. He was born on July 21st, 356 BC, or if you prefer BCE. He died on October the 11th, 323 BC, or if you prefer BCE. His father was Philip of Macedon. He was tutored, this is interesting to me, he was tutored by Aristotle until the age of 16. He conquered West Asia and North Africa and even made his way into India, where finally his troops were so homesick they convinced him to turn around. He was undefeated in battle, which is pretty impressive, and he died in Babylon. He founded 20 cities that bear his name, most notably, of course, Alexandria, Egypt, which later became a hub of Christianity. Now, how do we know this? And what I'm talking about here is, how does history work? How do I know all that stuff about Alexander the Great? And you can find that in any history book. You can find it on Wikipedia. How do we know these things? Well, there are 5 main sources for Alexander's life. One is Arrian, who is a Greek historian. He's writing in the 2nd century AD. Wait a minute, if Alexander's 300 BC and this guy Arrian is writing in the 2nd century AD, how's that work? The other one is Plutarch, who writes about Alexander in the 2nd century AD. Diodorus, a Sicilian historian, he's the oldest Greek source, and he is late 1st century. And then Curtius, who was a really nice guy. He was a Roman historian writing in the 1st century AD. Is that all we've got? Is that the best we got? Well, no, because those guys quote works that are lost to us. But there's no reason to doubt that I can think of. So they're quoting sources that were eyewitness testimony to those who actually knew Alexander. One is Anaximenes, a companion of Alexander, his teacher, one of his teachers. Aristobulus, a companion. Calisthenics, actually it's Callisthenes, but I guess that's where we get the name. He helped Alexander work out. And so he was the great nephew of Aristotle. So you have eyewitnesses that recorded things, but those works are lost, but they're quoted by those who have works that we at least have copies of. We don't have the autographs for any of those things I just mentioned. But that's how history works. We think we know what happened. We think we know about Alexander, and there's nothing that's happened since then we know about that would make what those guys record impossible. With all that said, how would we view then the New Testament? Well, the New Testament, here's what I want to show with this. The New Testament is also recorded history. It's recorded by eyewitnesses, originally by eyewitnesses, and we don't have those autographs, but we have copies of the very works that we're getting the information from, and those copies are good. We've already made the case that we have accurate copies. Did you know the New Testament, let's say, was written in the 1st century? And by the way, there's virtually no dispute about that. The more liberal critics would say that the New Testament was written, let's say, from 70 AD until maybe 100. Maybe they think the Gospel of John was written later than the 1st century, maybe 110, some would say. But nobody thinks it was written in the 2nd or 3rd century anymore. Everybody thinks it was written virtually in the 1st century, especially the writings of Paul. I mean, Paul, there's no dispute about this that I know of. Paul was executed by the Roman government during the reign of Nero, which was 63-64 AD. So all of Paul's epistles, now some would say he only wrote 7. Paul was executed 63-64 under the reign of Nero, but so was the Apostle Peter, by the way. But my point is, Paul knew all the other apostles. They say so, he says so, Peter refers to him, he refers to the Apostle Peter. They had meetings together. So you're pushing the dating of the New Testament back pretty early. So even though we don't have the autographs, we have good copies of those autographs that were written during the lifetime of the principle that they're talking about, that person being Jesus Christ. I think that's remarkable. The other thing that's remarkable is the time between the writings and the time we have. We have about 124, not about at this point, we do have 124 manuscripts that are written. They're copies of the autographs of the New Testament. They're written within the first 300 years. How many other ancient writers do we have copies of their writings within the first 300 years? 0, not a 1. The New Testament really is in a class by itself as to the early copies and the number of copies and the number of differences. We've talked about that before. Over the centuries, let's say we have 124 the first 300 years. Then we start getting a lot more after 400 years, 500 years, 600 years. And over the centuries, until the printing press was developed, those copies, those manuscripts only picked up 2% more material than we think were in the autographs, the originals. That's remarkable in itself. None of those additions, somebody trying to explain something or add a little bit here and there, none of them change any of the doctrines of the New Testament. And we can spot them because we have so many manuscripts. That's why if you have a Bible, other than the KJV, if you have a Bible, it's going to say these, in some places, a few places, these verses are not found in the oldest manuscripts. I can give you examples on that. I'll do that in another video. But I want to compare, as we close today, Pliny the Younger, great Roman historian. He wrote, and that's how we know some stuff about the Roman Empire, but we're waiting 700 years to get a copy of what he wrote. We don't have the originals, and the earliest copy we have was written 700 years after he wrote. Plutarch, 800 years. Josephus, the great, most of what we know, I looked up Wikipedia, the most we know about the Middle Eastern culture of the first century is from Josephus, it says, and the New Testament. Wikipedia says that. Josephus, we're waiting 800 years to get a copy of what he wrote. Polybius, 1,200 years. Pausanias, 1,400 years. Herodotus, great Greek historian, 1,500 years, and Xenophon, 1,800 years. What I want to say is that the New Testament is in a class by itself when it comes to historical sources, when it comes to historical evidence. There's nothing else like it. I think God made it that way so we could have confidence in it.